Roti, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the next in the series called A Closer Book. This is where I talk about 3 of my recent reads. Today we're up to book number 97, which is An Unrestored Woman by Shobhaa. She's also the author of Girls Burn Brighter, which is a novel that I read and reviewed here on the channel a few weeks ago. So if you haven't heard me review and rave about that book, you might want to watch that video where I do so next. An Unrestored Woman is a short story collection, and some of the characters that we meet here seem to be a lead into some of the characters that appear in Girls Burn Brighter. But because this is a short story collection, we also meet a lot of other kinds of characters. We meet other women who are disenfranchised, women who are abused and displaced for one reason or another. But we also get to meet some of the men who are antagonists or villains, and in a lot of cases some of them are victims themselves of the boundaries of the life that they live in India. First story is set during the time of partition, which is when India separated into 2 states, India and Pakistan, one country for Hindus and one country for Muslims, which seemed on paper probably to be a good thing in that we'd have a place for these 2 major religions to practice their religious beliefs without interference from the other group. However, it was also a period that was rife with violence, and a lot of the effects that it had on these women is represented in this first story, where a lot of widows were created because of violent encounters, one group killing another group just for the fact that they lived on the wrong side of the border. In the first story, we meet 3 women who have lost the men in their lives, and with that loss comes the loss of economic power, but also the loss of their status in their community, because men are seen as the ones who have the ability to establish and gain power, and their women are just the help in their lives. The women are just their accompaniments. And so we have a woman who's lost her son, and because she's a widow and now she has also lost her son, she's at the place where she really has no reason to live because there is no hope for her. She's too old to have any more sons, and she can't get remarried, so there is no hope for her. We also meet her daughter-in-law, who has lost her husband as well, but there is a place for her because there's a possibility that she could get remarried at some point. And there is a comparison between her status as a widow and that of another woman who has also lost her husband. But the comparison between the 2 marriages, the 2 experiences that these women had as wives, means that they mourn or see their loss in very different ways. And while these 2 young widows go to live on a camp, it's a camp that has been established for women who have been widowed because of the violence associated with partition. We get to see what life is like and what the reality of living in that period of time. The hope that one of those widows might harbor in her heart of what might happen in her life for her to be able to leave that camp. And sometimes what the reality of life outside would be like if one could return from widowhood to another state of being. What the author achieves by linking these stories and continuing the characters' narratives from one story to the next is that we get to see victims receive some kind of vengeance in later stories, or more likely to see villains receive their comeuppance for acts that they committed in one story, and we get to see negative things happen to them in the upcoming stories. One of my major criticisms about this work is that the stories felt absolutely too short. Each story was about 20 pages long, and we met a lot of characters and got a lot of themes and subplots in each one that didn't feel as though they were resolved, and even the continuity from one story to the next didn't feel like it was enough to really explore all the themes that the author tried to present in each work. So I was glad that I read her novel first, because I felt like she expounded way more on some of the themes that she mentioned here in her novel and was able to give a better resolution to some of those thematic studies in her novel than she was able to accomplish in this one. I gave each story an individual rating, and so I'll put my average rating right here so you'll see what my average rating is, even though I haven't calculated it yet, so I don't know what it is. But some of the stories got very high ratings for me. I think the first story I gave a 5 or 4 star, and there were several stories in here that were between a 3 and 4 star rating, but then there were a few that I gave 2 stars because I didn't feel like they were complete enough as stories to merit being included here, even though they provided a bridge from one story and one character set and one moment in time to another. I like this one nonetheless, and if you haven't read anything by Shobhaa and you'd like to dip your toes into her writing, then maybe this would be a good place to start. But I do think that her novel Girls Burn Brighter was just such a better executed work and more complete work that I would recommend that you read that one more than this if you have to choose. So this is book number 97. I hope you'll stick around for my discussion of book number 98. Today we're going to talk about Queenie by Candice Carthy Wlliams. The main character in this one is Queenie Jenkins. She's of Jamaican background, but she's growing up in England. Her grandparents were first generation immigrants from Jamaica. And so Queenie has grown up in England, and her friends are fellow children of immigrants, as well as she's having an interracial romance. And so Queenie's experience as a British Jamaican, or Jamaican British, I'm not sure how you would call that. Queenie's experience is very different from that of her grandparents who came as first generation immigrants, even that of her mother who's a first generation Londoner. But Queenie's life is being compared to that of her friends. And so the assortment of friends that Queenie has collected over the years includes a young woman named Chesky, who's of Ugandan background. Her parents are Ugandan immigrants. She has a friend who's Jewish, and she has a work friend whose ethnicity and background is not necessarily clearly defined. The situation is set up that through the relationship between these four friends, we see the intersection of cultures and how these people with very different backgrounds see the same situation, how they react to the same stimuli, and what of their experiences and reactions are based on being an immigrant or just of being a young person living in this world. Queenie Jenkins, she's a journalist. She has a good job, it seems, but based on decisions that she makes over the course of the novel, her life begins to spiral out of control. And while I could see where the author was trying to set up a situation that we'd have a very strong character arc, the fact that Queenie starts off very negative and remains negative for so much of the book, that she makes such odious choices and she puts herself in such extreme danger, rejecting relationships with people who seem to care about her and instead inviting people who are going to be violent in sexual ways, people who take advantage of her, people who abuse her. The fact that she invites these situations and seems to wallow in them for so long means that Queenie almost invites us to reject her as well. And so this book challenges the reader to develop a relationship with Queenie where you want to care for her, even though on the pages we see Queenie rejecting the people who do care for her. There's a lot about this book that is interesting. There's a lot about this book that is about comparisons between peoples and how the movement of time affects immigrants. And so we get a comparison between who Queenie is and her rejection of a lot of the things that provided stability for her grandparents. And I thought that that was so interesting. The fact that her grandparents are first generation immigrants, they're the people who went out of their way to make sacrifices to make sure that they were able to buy and maintain their own home. And so even though we have a constant exploration and almost sarcastic look at the sacrifices, the financial sacrifices that these older people make in order to maintain their lifestyle, we see the people who are making fun of them still enjoying the benefits of the sacrifices that those people made. So Queenie's grandparents, they own their own home, and it is the place of refuge for all these people who want to have a more free lifestyle. But when they come over, they want to criticize the grandparents for not letting them run the bills up for the water and for the electricity and so on. And so the novel provided a very interesting look at the life of the immigrant over the different spaces of time, but also compared the experiences of immigrants from very different backgrounds. Another thing that was really interesting about this book is that Queenie is a journalist, a black journalist living in England, and she's trying to use her job at the newspaper, use her platform to express her opinions about the injustice that is being done to black people in the United States. I felt like the author went out of her way to try to incorporate some political statements into the book. However, the fact that Queenie is such a negative character. I don't know if that impacted the political statement that this book might have made. And in fact, for me, because of my distaste for Queenie's character, the negative reaction that I had to her promiscuity and her wallowing in sexual violence and all these negative sexual expressions that she had, I felt like the political statement became such a subplot that I feel like some of that got lost in everything else. So ultimately, I'm giving this book a 3-star rating because the expressions of sex and the promiscuity just, for me, was very distasteful to read about. I don't feel like it was necessary to spend so much time dwelling on the things that she did in order to show Queenie's growth and her movement and to show the impact of the abuse that she suffered. So for me, this was not an enjoyable read. I wish I loved it a little bit more. I'd like to see what else this author writes, especially if she writes a character who's a little bit more stable. Queenie is not a representative of a lot of people. There are a lot of people, yes, who deal with these situations and deal with them in a negative way like Queenie does. But I wanted a character who I could root for a little bit more, and Queenie just wasn't it. So sorry that I didn't love this as much as I wanted to, but maybe next time. The next book we're going to talk about is book number 103 in my 2019 reading. If you can believe it, we're up to 103 already. And if you're wondering about the numbers that it seems that I've skipped out, that's because I'm going to be doing single book reviews for those books. They're either Man Booker winners or books that I read for the book club. So reviews, single book reviews will be coming out soon for those books. But for now, we're up to book number 103, which is All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. This is translated fiction. It was translated from the German by A.W. Wien. And if the cover of this book is to be believed, this is the greatest war novel of all time. Erich Maria Remarque was an active combatant during World War I, and after his experience in the war, he wrote this fictional account of a group of teenage boys who are classmates together and volunteer to enlist in World War I together. And they are recruited and they fight together. Some of them live and die together. And this book is that fictional experience. This was my first time reading something that was written by someone who was an active combatant in the German side of the war during World War I. And so that was a little bit different for me, but it really brought about a lot of the universality of war, because the experiences that these young men had are very similar to the experiences that men on the other side of the war would have had. And while we are triumphing for this group in this novel, for those of us on this side of the world, these were our enemies, or at least they were on the other side of the war. And so it brings about a little bit of a conflict. Do we champion for the characters in this story, or are we true to the people that we consider to be our heroes, the people that we know maybe from our families or from our communities or just from our history that we learn in our country? How do we reconcile reading these accounts with what we know from our own lives? There's a lot about this book that is to be appreciated, and the author should be lauded for what he brought to the average reader about the realities of this trench warfare, what it's like to fight as these men did with hand-to-hand combat and see death up close and to try to escape it almost at every point in their lives, and some of the compromises that they had to make with death, that if I survive, I'm going to take all the spoils of war that I can so that I can endure to fight another day. And with this story, we get to see some of the loss of innocence that these young men, these teenagers, had to live through, and what they gave up of their lives and what they became at the end. There is a jarring contrast between the experiences that these men have during the war and when they at some point return home, to see what they've been fighting for and yet to see the lives that their family members are living. And there's a lot of sadness. This is not a happy book. These are not happy scenes that happen in this book, and it seems to be tragic at all points, but the enduring theme about this is survival and what it takes to survive. Whether entering the war as a group of friends is harder or easier for these characters, because what does it mean when you have lost a friend, to watch someone that you grew up with and enjoyed the innocence of boyhood with? What is it like to see that person die? There's also the comparison between the relationships that these young men have together and the new friends that they make. There's an older man that Paul meets and fights with in the latter parts of this novel, who becomes almost a father figure to him. And there's a comparison between his relationship with this older man in the army and the relationship that he had with his father on the outside. And even as he goes home to visit his family, and he makes the comparison between the two men and the choices that he seems to make between the war and what should have been his real life, and how we're able to see his reconciling what his real life is. So I appreciated a lot about this novel. I'm not sure if I can say I enjoyed it, but I gave it a high 4-star rating. And if you haven't read this one, I'd recommend that you pick it up, even just for maybe understanding the universal idea of suffering both in and out of the war. And so that was book number 103. That's the end of this installment of A Closer Book. I hope you'll come back for my next discussion where I'll talk about 3 more recent reads. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. Let's talk in the comments. I'd love to hear from you if you've read any of these books, or if my discussing them now makes you want to pick them up. Let's talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.